know when I first started making sourdough bread, I thought it must be very complex because it's beautiful and delicious and it has that unique flavor profile, and there must be something really special about it. Sourdough is made up only of flour, of water, and of salt. The flour and the water ferment, which creates a sourdough starter. And one well-established sourdough starter can last you a lifetime of bread making, and it's actually quite simple to keep a sourdough starter alive. They are very resilient. So today I'm going to share with you how to make our family's favorite bread recipe. It's a staple in our home. It's more cost effective. Sourdough bread is also easier on our digestive system because it is a fermented food. If you know that you're planning on making a batch of sourdough bread, you do have to plan ahead a little bit. So you're going to want to make sure that your starter is fed. If you do not have sourdough starter, you can find a link down below for my dehydrated sourdough starter. This comes with detailed instructions on how to rehydrate it and get it ready for use. You can see here that this starter needs a feeding. I typically feed my starter about 10 to 12 hours before starting dough for bread making. My standard feeding for sourdough starter is 1 cup of flour and 1/2 cup of water. You'll see as I'm mixing in the flour and the water, the sourdough starter begins to thicken. Once the flour and water is well incorporated, you'll cover your jar loosely and leave it at room temperature until it becomes active. I often mark my jar with a rubber band so that I can clearly see where my starter began. Keep an eye on your starter and not the clock. Once your sourdough starter has doubled in size and you see active bubbles, it's ready to use. The first step is to add 100 grams of active starter into your mixing bowl. Be sure to set your kitchen scale to grams before beginning this recipe and tare your scale to 0 before adding in each new ingredient. Next, add 700 grams of water to your active sourdough starter. You'll mix the sourdough starter and the water until it becomes milky. And next you'll add 1,000 grams of flour. Top your flour with 20 grams of salt. Once all of your ingredients have been added to the bowl, you will no longer need your kitchen scale. Mix the ingredients until they are all well incorporated and you have a shaggy mass of dough. I often use my hands to incorporate all the ingredients, or you can use a dough whisk like this one. Once your ingredients are incorporated and you have a shaggy mass of dough left in your bowl, cover the bowl and allow your dough to rest for 1 hour. After your dough has rested for 1 hour, you will perform your first set of stretch and folds. Before I stretch and fold my dough, I like to wet my hands with water so that the dough does not stick to my hands. You will gently stretch the dough upward and fold it over itself. Give the bowl a quarter turn until you have stretched and folded all 4 sides. Again, you will cover your bowl with a tea towel and allow the dough to rest for 30 minutes. After your dough has rested for 30 minutes, you'll do a last set of stretch and folds before bulk fermentation. You'll notice the texture of your dough has more tension this time. After completing both sets of stretch and folds, you will cover your dough and set it aside to rest for 8 to 10 hours. This long resting period is considered bulk fermentation. This is the time while your bread is developing its unique tangy flavor, and also while the proteins and the glutens are being broken down in the flour by the sourdough starter, allowing our bodies to digest our bread more easily. You'll know that your dough is ready to shape when it has nearly doubled in size and you see some bubbles forming at the top. When you see signs that your dough is ready to be shaped, you're going to empty it out onto a floured surface. You'll no longer wet your hands before handling the dough. You'll want to flour them instead. Since we will be making 2 bread loaves, you will divide the dough into 2 equal parts. You will roll the dough into itself, pinching together the seams. Cup your hands around the bottom of the dough and turn it in a circular motion while you build tension in the loaf. Once you have formed your dough into a tight ball, gently place it onto parchment paper. Use the parchment paper as a sling to put it back into the bowl for final proofing. Cover your shaped loaf with a towel and allow it to proof for 1 to 2 hours at room temperature before scoring and baking. Repeat the shaping and final proofing steps for your second loaf. Check your loaves in 1 to 2 hours. If you gently press into the loaf, it should spring back slowly, showing that it's ready to bake. If it springs back too quickly, give it a little more time to rise. After this final rise, when you see that your loaves are ready to bake, you will place your Dutch oven into your oven and preheat the oven to 450 degrees. While your Dutch oven is preheating, you will score your sourdough loaves. I like to score my loaves just before placing them into the Dutch oven, and I also sprinkle a little bit of flour over the top before scoring them, just to show the detail of the scoring a little more clearly in the final result. Flouring your sourdough loaf is not a necessary step when scoring, and you really only need about a 3-inch score mark at the top of the bread. After scoring your sourdough loaf, you will use that parchment paper again as a sling to place your loaf into your preheated Dutch oven. Your Dutch oven will be very hot at this time, so be careful and use hot pads while handling it. You'll place the lid on and bake your loaf for 25 minutes covered. After 25 minutes, remove the lid and bake for another 15 minutes uncovered. Removing the lid for the last 15 minutes is what gives your bread its golden, crunchy crust. This may be the hardest step, but you'll need to allow time for your bread to fully cool before cutting into it. Cutting into your bread too early will result in a gummy texture. If you want to achieve a light, airy texture, allow your bread to fully cool